Hi, I'm Linda Mal, and welcome to Art This Week. In this week's episode, we visit the Modern and speak with Chief Curator Michael Auping about the exhibition, Urban Theater, New York Art in the 1980s. Now for Art This Week.
Hi, I'm Logan Smith, and I'm here at the Modern with Chief Curator Michael Auping to discuss the exhibition, Urban Theater, New York Art in the 1980s. Thank you for being with us today, Michael.
My pleasure.
In viewing the works in the exhibition, you can definitely see the theatricality within the artworks and how these artists are using New York as a stage for their art. How, when curating the show, did you come up with the theme theater as you're putting things together?
I think that you have to appreciate that this generation of artists that moved to New York around 1980 or the late 70s, it was the baby boomer generation. And one thing we know about the baby boomers is that they all have very specific ideas. They all expect to be heard. They're all very ambitious. And the other thing to think about with the baby boomer generation is that we all were raised, since we were infants, on television, film, and advertising, all of which are very theatrical. So I think that filters into all of their works. And as I started thinking about the show, the idea of an urban metropolis like New York, as you say, being a stage for artwork, that's how the title came about.
What is your history with these artists in particular, and did you have relationships with them at that time?
Well, I'm a baby boomer myself and an art historian, and these are artists I really, quote unquote, grew up with, as it were. We didn't all live in the same cities, but we attended a lot of the same openings, went to a lot of the same shows, and I did have a relationship with most of the artists in this exhibition. But in a lot of cases, I hadn't seen these people in quite a few years. We've all gone our separate ways. Let's not forget, the 80s was 35 years ago. So I reintroduced myself, and we had some good times talking about the energy of the 80s, the energy of New York in the 80s. I was visiting New York probably every 2 to 3 weeks during most of the 80s. And it was an incredibly energetic environment. I mean, there was something going on every night. And I would argue actually that the 80s were the last time that the New York art world actually had a centralized art community. In the 90s and afterwards, artists moved out of the city. They got big places in Long Island, and it's now a global art world. So the art world is a community now. In the 80s, New York was still a quote unquote neighborhood, or at least 3 neighborhoods: downtown, midtown, uptown.
We're looking back on the 80s now, 30 years later. Who are some of the artists that really stood out during that time?
Well, it was really the advent of what we now refer to as the art star. And in the 80s, one of the biggest art stars, particularly in the early 80s, was Julian Schnabel. This is a painting by Julian right now. And Julian took it on himself to try to re-energize painting after a decade of minimalist sculpture and very minimalist and conceptualist artwork. Before he made money selling his paintings, he was a head chef at Mickey Ruskin's Ocean Club in New York. So he had access to a lot of crockery, a lot of broken plates and cups. And so he just filled his studio with this crockery and started just throwing it into the paintings and then painting over the crockery. So this was Julian's way of getting people's attention back to painting. And Julian, along with a number of other so-called bad boys of painting, were represented by Mary Boone. They all had huge shows, sometimes triple shows. In other words, they would open at Mary Boone Gallery, Leo Castelli Gallery, and Speroni Westwater Gallery. They would have 3 gallery show opening and sell the show out, sometimes before the show opened. So there was a certain hype around some of these artists. Certainly there was a lot of hype around Julian, and that hype came from a new generation of collectors that had money They were inquisitive, but they were also very interested in art as investment. So the 80s was the beginning of where the art market is now.
The 80s, really, you saw this rise in graffiti art and art out in the streets. Can you speak to some of that and how you've used this in the exhibition?
Well, graffiti was a very energetic movement that did develop in the 80s, and there was a lot of controversy about it at the time. You know, there were some people who thought that graffiti artists should be put in jail, that they should be arrested because, you know, they were making art on public property or private property. But keep in mind that where graffiti art was taking place was really on very old, dilapidated buildings, and actually the graffiti enhanced these buildings. I mean, a lot of these landlords were not putting money into their buildings. The graffiti artists, I think, in some ways, upped the value of their property. Also, graffiti art fits really well into the thesis of this show, which, again, the title is Urban Theater. And you know, graffiti is sort of the ultimate urban theater. You know, it's a very late night performance with no audience. Somebody comes out with a handful of spray paint cans and does this performance, which is a painting on a wall, disappears, and you wake up the next morning, walk down the street, and you see this amazing mural. So graffiti really energized the art community, and it was sort of the flip side of all of the glamour and money that was being paid to the gallery shows. Here were artists doing things for nothing. Sort of, you know, an ephemeral performance that would eventually get painted out. But what happened, interestingly enough, and there are still a couple of Keith Haring's that are in New York that you can go see, some of them were so good that people didn't dare paint over them. I mean, that's how good they were.
So looking back on the 80s, we see this really dynamic period of time within the economic and political landscape of the United States. And it was really interesting for the art world because on one hand, the government's cutting funding for the arts programs, but on the other hand, we're seeing, you know, people for the first time spending astronomical amounts of money in art and collectors coming out of the woodworks investing in arts like you had mentioned. So how do you think this affected these downtown artists, artists living in New York, positively and negatively?
Well, I think that, you know, there was a new generation of collector that developed in the 80s, and it had a lot to do with this generation having seen what some pioneering collectors did in the 60s and 70s, and they began to understand that art wasn't just a creative thing, that it could be an asset class, it could be an investment, and they were very smart about this. And the artists knew this. Some of them rebelled against it, some of them played to it. You know, this was the era of Reaganomics and trickle-down economy, and it trickled down in a big way to the art world. So people were paying very high prices for very avant-garde art. And some of the artists knew how to play to this new situation. And one of the sections in this exhibition I title Promotion and Display. And there was no artist who was better at promotion and display than Jeff Koons. Jeff Koons grew up in Pennsylvania. He went to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, but when he came to New York to make money before his art sold, you know, he sold memberships for the Museum of Modern Art, broke a record for sales. Then he was a stock trader for a brief period of time. All of this while he's making his art. And he made these fantastic pieces very early on that were shown at the New Museum in New York. It was a show simply called The New, because all of the collectors at that time wanted things that were brand new. New idea, new looking, bright, shiny. And Koons was smart enough to give it to them. And he gave them vacuum cleaners because he knew these people wanted very clean, minimalist looking things. And of course the vacuum cleaner is a fantastic metaphor for cleanliness. So there's a lot going on in Koons' work. Some people think he's the most important artist of the 80s. Others think he's the worst artist of the 80s. But that's the nature of the 1980s. We're still arguing about it. History is a funny thing. You know, you really don't know what great art is in the moment. And even though the 80s are 35 years ago, 3.5 decades or so, you know, we still can't say who is the great one and who isn't the great one. Because something sells for a lot of money is not necessarily an indication of its art historical quality. It may very well be, and often that does coincide, but certainly not always. So, you know, we're still trying to figure out the 80s, which is why I think it's a good time to revisit this decade. All of these artists in this show are the artists that I and my colleagues argued about continually. Who is better, Jeff Koons or Cindy Sherman? Is Julian Schnabel great, or is it David Sally? Is it Jenny Holzer? This show is all about those arguments that we had, and we're still arguing about it.
Here in the exhibition, you have some early text pieces from Jenny Holzer, as well as a recently acquired kind of blue piece by her that's more contemporary. How have you seen these artists grow over the years, and how do you think them living in New York during that time period has affected their career in the long run?
Well, I think what happens in a metropolis when you have a very dense art community is that there is a lot of dialogue between the artists, and there's a lot of critique, and it sharpens one's mind. You know, that was the whole thing about, you know, do I stay in California? Do I move to New York? The people who moved to New York would argue you get smarter when you get to New York because people challenge you. And I remember seeing Jenny Holzer's work in really the late 70s, and they were just posters put around Soho, you know, sort of like posters for a CBGB performance or posters for a film. And these were posters of her truisms: protect me from what I want, you know, men don't protect you anymore. And they were always unsigned, didn't know who she was, and eventually I met her in an opening and started following her work, and she went from these posters to doing these LED signs. And that became her signature medium. And I have seen her grow from doing the posters to these simple LED signs, this is called the Survival Series, to doing massive installations of these LED signs, like the one we have here at our museum, and like the one that is at Cowboys Stadium. And you know, it's amazing to see these artists grow. Jenny was one of the people I really followed for quite a long time. And in 1990, I was asked to be the commissioner for the American Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. And I took Jenny Holzer. So she was sort of, at that time, she was my choice from the 80s. And I still think she's a great artist.
We want to thank Michael for speaking with us. You can find more information on the exhibition at themodern.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching.
I still got your Polaroid. The thought of you